are controlled by a counter variable. There may be situations where a programmer or a developer needs to create a loop in which they don't really know how many times the loop will iterate. It may be based on how many times the user needs the loop to iterate, or an unknown amount of data that the program has to process. In this case, you can create a loop that uses a sentinel value to exit the loop. A sentinel value can be just a dummy value, a value that maybe the user wouldn't enter under normal circumstances, or it can be something like clicking a cancel button. In this project, we are going to prompt the user for a series of numbers, and we'll take those numbers, sum them, and display them to the user. The prompt will continue to appear in our browser window until the user enters a -999 to stop or exit the loop. So the sentinel value for this loop will be -999. In your Google Drive folder, you should see sum av loop. We're going to start by creating just a loop that does the sum, and then we'll modify it so that it also does an average. All this information I just told you is on this page, so if you need to reference it in the future, you'll have a copy of it. Okay, so let's go down to our script section. Let's start by thinking about our variables and what kind of variables that we'll need for this. So we know that we need something to store the number that the user is inputting, and then we need something that will store the total, our sum total of all the numbers. So let's create those variables. We'll just declare them and initialize them at 0. By initializing these at a 0 value, it lets JavaScript know that these are numeric variable data types. We're going to use a while loop, and for our condition, this loop is going to continue to iterate until our sentinel value is entered. So as long as number, which is what the user's entering in, as long as that's not -999, our loop is going to iterate. Inside this loop, we need to prompt the user for a number or the 999, but we also need to add the number to our sum total. So we'll have a prompt that looks something like this that's going to ask for the number, and then we need to take the number and add it to our sum total. Now this is where the sequentialness and what order that we type our code matters. So let's put our equation below this prompt. That's the incorrect way, but I'll show you why it's incorrect. What equation could we write that would take the value of number, add it to sum, and store it back into the sum variable? The long way to write it is like this. And that's fine if you want to write it that way. It's absolutely fine. But the shortcut way would be this. So it's taking the current value of sum, it's adding it to number, and storing it back into sum. Okay? Now, in order for us to see if this loop is doing anything, we need to have some output on the screen. So we've got some input here, our processing. We've got to have a little bit of output. So I'm going to do a document.write. And concatenate the sum of the numbers you entered is with the value of sum. Okay, now if we test this, this is not going to work exactly how we anticipate. if I enter 1 and 2, those are the two numbers that I want to add. I don't want to add my Sentinel value, but I have to input that Sentinel value in order for my loop to stop. So when I enter -999, the loop stops, but it also calculated -999 into my sum total. Okay? The way that I could fix this is just by moving this equation before the prompt. Okay? So it's just an easy fix, but it's just thinking about how the code is going to execute. So now if I do 1 and 2, I got to enter that Sentinel value to exit the loop. I get 3. Okay? And that's correct. That's what we wanted. Now let's modify this program to add an average. So while we're calculating the sum, we could also calculate the average of the numbers. What do we need to know to be able to calculate the average? Well, we have a sum of a group of numbers, but what other thing do we need to know to calculate average? We need to know how many numbers we have. Well, it just so happens that we have a way to figure out how many numbers the user enters. We can use a counter variable. I'm going to create a variable called count, and again, initialize it at 0. And then I'll also need a variable to store my average, so I'll go ahead and create that as well. You know, you just have a count plus plus in our loop, like we've done with our counter control loop, so that each time this loop iterates, it adds 1 to count. And that'll be fun, right? Right? Okay, so let's test this out. Just for the purposes of testing this code, I'm going to print the value of count. Before we do that, I'm going to add line break on the previous document.write, so this appears on the next line. Okay, we're going to fix this. We're just kind of testing our code and taking a look under the hood per se. Okay, so if I enter 2 numbers, I need count to be 2, like, because I want to average 2 numbers. So if I want to take the average, and let's take 2 simple numbers that we would easily know the average of. So I'll say, like, we'll do 10 and 20. Okay, we have to enter that 999 to finish. And now count is 3. You see that? Because really we did input 3 numbers. Only the 999 was the number that we inputted to stop the loop. So how could we calculate average when our counter variable is always coming up wrong? Well, it's not that hard. You just have to think about it, manipulate the code a little bit. We can say our average is the sum. So after this loop iterates, sum is going to store the sum of the numbers, not including the -999, divided by, and then count tells me how many times this loop iterated, but includes 999. So we can just subtract 1 from count. If we subtract 1 from count, that takes away the iteration where the input was -999. Okay? So now let's just print the average of the numbers you entered is average. All right, let's test our code now and see if it works correctly. So I'll do 10, 20, and -999. The sum of the numbers you entered is 30, and the average of the numbers you entered is 15. That's correct because we entered 2 numbers, which totaled in 30, so 30 divided by 2 is 15. Okay? I'm not expecting you to be able to write a loop like this. I just think the more you practice with loops, the better it helps you understand it, okay? So I'm just grading that you completed this project. But with all of the codes and tutorials, especially when we get deeper into JavaScript, really start thinking about what the code is doing. It's not simply enough to just type what I type. Try to think about what's happening in this code. Like, what are these words meaning? What are they doing? Let's try one more. This is another example of a Sentinel-Controlled loop. And in this time, this time we're going to create a Sentinel value that is just the word done. So when the user types in done that they're finished, then the loop will stop executing. In this instance, we are going to calculate gross pay. We're just going to use a simple calculation similar to the overtime project that we did in the last chapter. In this case, we want the user to enter an employee's name and then how many hours they worked and what their rate of pay is. Once they enter all the employees, their hours, and their pay rate, it will print to the screen the employee's name and then how much they got paid. Okay? Let's start in our script section. We have a button here. We're going to have all of this code execute on a button click. So let's create a new function called calcPay. And because we might test this periodically, let's just go ahead and do our event listener. We need to do document.getElementById. It's been a minute since we've done this, so you might have forgotten. So document.getElementById will get us to this object here as soon as we do this ID enter pay. And once we get to that object, we want to add an event listener so that when we click that object, the calcPay function executes. Okay, we need a few variables that we're going to go ahead and declare before we start with our loop. We need to know the hours, the rate, and the pay. To get this loop started, we need to ask the user for their name. So let's say var name prompt. Excuse me, they're not going to enter their name. They're going to enter the employee's name that they're calculating their payroll for. Enter employee's first name. And we're going to use a do while loop for this. So I'm going to go ahead and put my key syntax in. And we want this loop to execute. So once the user starts entering a name, we want this loop code to keep iterating until they enter the word done, D-O-N-E. So we'll say while name is not done. So name is going to store whatever they enter for the prompt for name. As soon as they type done, the loop stops executing. Okay? We want to use a do while loop because we at least want to calculate the payroll for this first employee. Okay? So when they type this employee the first time, they can enter the payroll information, and then the next time it iterates, they can enter done and it'll exit and just show the first employees. But if they want to enter more information, they'll be able to do so. Once we're in here, let's ask for the hours. And because we're going to do math with it, let's parse. And I'm going to parse float because it would be possible for a person to work a non-whole amount of hours, like a decimal amount of hours. And we're going to be really specific with this one, and include their name in the prompt. And we need to find out how much they make per hour. Again, this could be a float as well, because like you can make $7 and what's minimum wage? $7.15. I don't know how much it is now. I'll say, what is name? Look what we're going to do here. We're going to do an apostrophe S right at the beginning. But if you do that apostrophe S in code, code thinks you're trying to open up a set. So I got to delete that last one. So names hourly pay rate. Okay, this one is going to have an if-else statement inside of the loop. Because if the user, if the employee works more than 40 hours, we want to calculate their payroll at time and a half. But if they worked 40 hours or fewer, we want to calculate it. It'll just be rate times hours. So we'll say if hours is greater than 40, there's a couple of different ways that you could write this equation. So I'm just going to say 40 times rate, because that's your basic pay rate up until 40 hours. But then any hours that you work over 40 hours, so I'll do hours minus 40, you get paid at your rate times 1.5. Now, if you didn't work more than 40 hours, that means you just get paid the regular rate times hours. Okay, outside of that if statement, let's write to the screen document.write. Let's say the employee's name. I'm going to concatenate that with, remember, our non-breaking space. So I'm going to do a non-breaking space and then a $sign, because this is money. And I'll concatenate that with pay, and then I'll concatenate that with a line break, because we don't want every employee written on the same line. Okay? Now, this would actually, even though it looks like a lot of code, has not done one of the essential features of a loop. We have not given an opportunity to change something about the test condition. Our test condition is, while name is not done, we've only prompted for the name one time, right here. So if the user did not enter done the first time this prompt appears, this loop would become an infinite loop. So we need to give an opportunity to change something about the test condition. So we'll do another prompt, and on this prompt, we'll say enter another employee's name, or enter done when finished. This is the first time we've used the same variable on a prompt, but that's completely legal. Remember, a variable is just a place in our computer's memory, and whatever is stored there can be changed and updated as our program executes. All right, let's test it in a browser and see how this works. So if we click to begin, I'm going to say I have an employee, Mario, and let's say that he worked 40.5 hours this week, and let's say he gets paid $10 an hour. Now I can enter done and it'll stop this loop, or I can enter another employee now. So I'll enter Luigi, and Luigi's a hard worker. Let's say that he worked 50 hours this week, and let's say he gets paid $12.85 an hour. Okay? So I'm done, so I'll type done, and this is our Sentinel value to end this loop. So when I click OK, it prints the content here. Okay? So just another example of a Sentinel-controlled loop. I know these loops are much more complicated and they will continue to be more complicated. But again, I'm not asking you to code this loop. I think just practicing helps a lot. One more thing. When we have numbers like this that are decimal numbers, you can do a method called toFixed. So if I go to pay and I do toFixed, and I can say 2 decimal places. If I do that and refresh this, so I'm going to speed this up. If we do toFixed, it will take the decimal value and show 2 decimal places. So whatever I type here will be how many decimal places it shows. But we'll talk more about that next chapter. That's just something else we can do and add. Our main focus here with all these projects are just trying to understand the concepts of loops, how they're used and how they work. Okay, that's it for this chapter. You don't have any more projects, just your little test to complete. And this is it before Christmas. So I hope you enjoy your winter break, and I'll see you next semester for some fun JavaScript learning. Yay!